The quietest hour was 3:47 a.m. Lena knew this. It was a fact, observed and logged over countless shifts at Mercy General Hospital. The circadian despair of patients and staff alike dipped to its deepest point. The false dawn still a distant rumor. The overhead fluorescents hummed a low, steady note, bleaching color from the walls and faces. This was her world, a realm of linoleum, antiseptic, and the soft, rhythmic percussion of life support systems. Her movements were a study in conservation. At the central nurse's station, she updated a digital chart, her keystrokes precise and silent. Her blue scrubs were faded but clean. Her shoes, supportive, black, and unscuffed, carried her without a sound. She was a fixture here, as much a part of the night as the custodial cart rattling in the distance. At 42, with lines of quiet fatigue around her sea-gray eyes and dark hair pulled into a severe, practical bun, she was professionally invisible. To Dr. Evans, the brash resident, she was a source of reliable data. To Chloe, the young night nurse, she was a quiet relief when things got complex. To everyone, she was just Lena. Competent, unassuming. There. She made her rounds. In room 307, Mr. Alvarez slept fitfully, his oxygen mask misting with each breath. Lena didn't just check the monitor. She adjusted the flow with a subtle turn, her fingers briefly checking the warmth of his hand. In room 310, young Maya, post-op appendectomy, was awake and scared. Lena said nothing. She simply poured a cup of water, placed the straw within reach, and rested a steadying hand on the girl's forehead for a 3 count. The girl's breathing deepened. The silence was the communication. Passing the lounge, she caught a fragment of conversation. Dr. Evans, leaning against the doorframe, coffee in hand, was holding court to a bored-looking intern. "So we page Lena for the difficult sticks. Hands like a vice, never misses. Probably did it for racehorses before this." He chuckled at his own joke. The intern smiled politely. Lena paused, not in the doorway, but in the blind spot just before it. Her expression, had anyone seen it, did not change. It simply settled. She looked down at her own hands, strong, networked with faint scars and that faded, blurred tattoo on her right hand, a smudge that might have once been an anchor or a geometric shape. She turned them over, flexed once, and continued her walk. Back at the station, she logged the vitals, the screen's glow reflected in her calm eyes. She noted the time, 3:52 a.m., 5 minutes since the last check. The rhythm was the point. The predictability was the structure that held the chaos of this place at bay. For now, the only crises were medical. For now, the only threats were infections and failing organs. She allowed herself a single, deep breath that did not quite reach the bottom of her lungs. A breath of a woman conserving energy for a marathon whose finish line she could not see. The main ER doors, 30 yards down the hall, remained still. The night stretched, thin and fragile. She was just a nurse. The clock ticked over to 4 a.m. The first irregularity was the sound. At 4:17 a.m., the hydraulic sigh of the automatic ER doors was too sharp, too fast. They didn't part. They were shouldered open. Lena's head came up from the supply log she was reviewing, not with a jerk, but with the smooth, unhurried pivot of a radar dish. 3 men. One, the largest, slumped between the other 2, head down, a hand clutched to his abdomen. Blood, shockingly bright under the fluorescence, seeped through his fingers and stained his gray hoodie. The 2 supporting him were talking over each other, voices strained with a panic that didn't reach their eyes. "Help him! He's stabbed! He's bleeding out!" Lena was already moving, not running, but with a swift, gliding pace that closed the distance. Her primary nurse's assessment was automatic. Male, mid-30s, apparent penetrating abdominal trauma, conscious but unresponsive. But beneath that, the other assessment, the one wired into her marrow, began its cold calculus. Irregularity. 1. The blood. It was arterial bright, but the flow pattern on the fabric was wrong. It spread from a central point with a uniform saturation, like a poured stain, not the pulsing, directional seep of a deep wound under pressure. Irregularity 2. The pain. The injured man, head lolling, let out a low groan. But his body language was passive, not clenched. The muscles of his neck and shoulders, visible where his hoodie gaped, were loose. He was carrying weight, not guarding a wound. Irregularity. 3. The companions. They called for help, but their attention was not on their friend's face or his injury. Their eyes, darting, hyper-alert, scanned the ceiling corners, the doorways to the interior corridors, the security camera dome above the entrance. They weren't looking for a doctor. They were mapping the terrain. Chloe, the young nurse, rushed forward with a wheelchair. Lena intercepted it with a subtle shift of her body. "Bay 3 is open and closest," she said, her voice a low, calm monotone that cut through the panicked chatter. "Bring him this way." She directed not with a pointed finger, but with a slight turn of her shoulder, guiding them away from the main triage desk and the heart of the ER. As the group shuffled past, Lena fell in behind. Her gaze was no longer that of a caregiver. She saw the boot of the man on the left, black, leather, a specific brand of polymer toe tactical boot, scuffed but well-maintained. It was incongruous with his cheap, torn jeans. She saw the jacket of the man on the right, hanging open. At the small of his back, under the fabric, was a hard, right-angled bulge. Not a phone, not a wallet. The distinct print of a pistol's slide. She saw the injured man's hand gripping his abdomen. The knuckles were scarred, the fingers thick. On the underside of the wrist, a patch of faded ink. A blurred insignia she couldn't make out, but whose style she recognized. They reached Bay 3, a curtained-off area. As the two men heaved their companion onto the gurney with a grunt, Lena stepped to the nurse's station console just outside. She picked up a permanent marker, her movements deliberate. On the empty margin of a discarded patient intake form, she didn't write. She made 3 small, discrete marks, a short vertical line for the leader, the one with the pistol, whose eyes held a cold, evaluating sheen. A circle for the follower, the one with the boots, who kept looking to the leader for cues. A check mark for the wild card, the injured man, whose condition was a variable. She capped the marker. The sound was a soft, definitive click in the quiet bay. Inside the curtain, one of the men was demanding painkillers. Chloe was flustered, trying to explain protocol. Lena's eyes lifted from the marks on the paper. She looked down the long, empty corridor, then back at the flimsy curtain surrounding Bay 3. The equation had changed. The medical problem was a facade. The real problem was now contained within her perimeter, and they had no idea who was really in charge of it. The illusion of control dissolved at 4:26 a.m. Lena was at the medication dispenser, her back to the wall, counting out acetaminophen tabs for a post-op patient. Her body was angled to maintain a sight line on Bay 3's curtain. The hospital's internal radio, a constant crackling background murmur at the central station, suddenly spiked in volume and urgency. A voice, tight with static and stress, cut through. "Units respond. Officer down. Shots fired at First Commerce Bank. Suspects believed to be 3 males, last seen fleeing east on foot toward the Mercy general vicinity. Suspects are considered armed and..." The transmission cut off as the head of security, a burly ex-cop named Walters, grabbed the handset. But the damage was done. A visible ripple went through the night staff. The orderly pushing a mop stopped. The resident, Dr. Evans, looked up from his chart, his face pale. Lena didn't move. She closed the medication drawer with a soft thud. The radio had provided the why. The 3 marks on her paper were the who. Her mind superimposed a tactical map over the hospital floor plan. East on foot. The ER was the easternmost entrance. They hadn't fled toward the hospital. They had fled into it, seeking chaos, seeking hostages, seeking a bargaining chip. Walter's voice boomed over the PA system, strained into an attempt at calm. Attention all staff. This is a code gray lockdown. All external doors are now secured. Please proceed with standard shelter-in-place protocols. Security to the ER. The distant thunk-clunk of magnetic locks engaging resonated through the building. The main ER doors were now sealed. The quiet hum of the night was replaced by a new, tense silence. They were all in a box, and 3 of the people in the box were predators. From behind the curtain of Bay 3, a voice, the leader's, sharp and low. "What the hell was that?" Chloe's nervous reply, muffled. "Just a drill, probably. We have them sometimes." Bullshit. Lena saw the curtain twitch. A slice of the leader's face appeared, scanning the corridor. His eyes were no longer performing panic. They were flat, hard, assessing the new reality. He saw the security guard posted at the now locked main doors. He saw the staff clustering in confused, anxious knots. He saw the locked-down exit. His gaze swept past Lena, still standing by the dispenser. Just a nurse, counting pills. The curtain fell shut. Urgent, whispered conversation erupted from the bay. Lena moved. Not toward the bay, but away, to a supply closet. Her actions were efficient, purposeful, but to any observer they were just a nurse preparing for a potential influx. She pulled down a box of sterile gauze, a roll of medical tape, a bottle of saline. Standard items, but her mind was cataloging non-standard assets. The heavy IV pole in the corner, a potential blunt instrument. The Sharps disposal box on the wall, locked, but the unit itself was solid steel. The geography. The only exit from Bay 3 was into the main corridor, which fed left to the ambulance bay, also locked, and right past the nurses' station into the interior hospital. The nurses' station was a choke point. Beyond it were the vulnerable, patients in rooms, the staff lounge, the pediatric wing elevator. She placed the medical supplies on a cart and pushed it slowly back towards the nurses' station, a picture of routine. As she passed the entrance to the ambulance bay, she saw Walters briefing 2 other security officers, their faces grim. They were armed with tasers and pepper spray. Against determined men with a firearm, it was a dangerous mismatch. Lena parked her cart. She picked up a pen and the marked intake form. She drew a quick, rough box to represent the ER wing. She marked an X for Bay 3. She drew a line from the X to the choke point at the nurses' station. That line was the threat axis. The lockdown had not contained the danger. It had concentrated it. It had turned her medical wing into a battlefield with one avenue of approach, non-combatants in every room, and rules of engagement that were impossibly tangled. She looked at the 3 symbols on her page, the line, the circle, the check. They were no longer just suspicious individuals. They were a contained cell, and they now knew they were trapped. A trapped animal was the most dangerous kind. The crisis was no longer impending. It was breathing the same antiseptic air, separated from her by 20 feet and a thin blue curtain. The pressure inside Bay 3 found its first vent at 4:38 a.m. The curtain ripped back, and the follower, the one with the tactical boots, stepped out. His name, according to the fake ID he'd given Chloe, was Mike. His posture was rigid, his eyes wide with a performative anxiety that didn't match the cold calculation in them. "I need some air," he announced, his voice too loud for the quiet hall. He began walking, not toward the sealed main doors where the security guard stood, but purposefully down the corridor toward the interior of the hospital, toward the choke point at the nurses' station and the vulnerable areas beyond. Security Officer Riggs, a young man with more enthusiasm than experience, stepped into his path. "Sir, lockdown protocols. I need you to return to your bay." "My friend's dying in there and I'm freaking out." Mike snapped, trying to sidestep. Riggs moved to block him, his hand instinctively resting on his taser. The situation was a dry spark near tinder. Lena was there before the spark could catch. She inserted herself not between the two men but slightly to the side, turning her body to present a neutral, procedural barrier. She held a digital thermometer and a blood pressure cuff, mundane tools that became props of authority. "Sir," she said, her voice flat, devoid of empathy or confrontation. It was the tone of immutable policy. "You've just been in a potential blood-borne pathogen exposure zone. Until we complete a contamination assessment, you cannot enter the clean corridors. It's a Category 2 biohazard protocol." Mike blinked, thrown by the bureaucratic obstacle. "What? I just need to walk." "If you breach the containment perimeter," Lena continued, her eyes on the thermometer's display as if reading vital data, "you risk carrying pathogens into the post-operative and immunosuppressed patient zones. That's a reportable offense to the county health department. It would also necessitate a mandatory 72-hour quarantine for you and your companions in an isolation ward." She finally looked at him. "Do you want a quarantine ward, or do you want to be able to leave when the police clear this lockdown?" The threat was perfect. It wasn't a challenge to his strength. It was an entrapment by red tape. It spoke of consequences, not bullets, but forms, fines, and confined, observed isolation. His eyes flickered toward the curtain of Bay 3, seeking guidance he couldn't get. Lena pivoted seamlessly to Officer Riggs. "Officer, I need you to log this interaction for the biohazard report. Time, location, individual's stated intention to breach containment." She handed him a blank clipboard from her cart. "Use this. The form needs to be filed with security and infection control immediately." She gave Riggs a look, a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a nurse's look. It was an instruction. "Take this and go." Riggs, confused but grasping at a defined task, took the clipboard. Right, yes." He retreated toward the security office, his confrontation broken. Mike stood frozen, his initiative utterly dissolved. The path was physically open, but Lena's words had woven an invisible cage of protocol around him. To move forward was to admit he didn't care about a fake quarantine, revealing his indifference to the medical fiction. To stay was to submit. "The safest place for you is in the bay with your friend," Lena stated, turning her back to him as if the matter was settled. She began wiping down her cart with an alcohol swab, a study in mundane routine. "We'll update you when we have information." Defeated by paperwork and sterile procedure, Mike scowled and retreated, yanking the curtain closed behind him with a furious rustle. Silence reclaimed the corridor. Lena finished wiping the cart's handle, her movements slow and exact. The cost of the move was internal. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a traitorous drumbeat she forced to calm through controlled breath. The confrontation had been a probe. She had responded, and now they knew the nursing staff wasn't entirely passive. But they also knew she was the point of contact, the source of rules. She looked at the curtain. They were now aware of the biohazard fiction. They would adapt. She had gained a little time and protected the interior, but she had also slightly clarified the board. She picked up her pen. Next to the circle on her paper, she drew a small question mark. Then, a larger one next to the leader's line. The first move was over. The game was now acknowledged by both sides. The clock read 4:52 a.m. The lockdown stretched, a taut wire vibrating with silent tension. Lena stood at the nurse's station console, her posture one of weary focus. The page in front of her was no longer a patient form. It was an operational schematic. The three symbols were now nodes in a system, and she began to manipulate the system with the only weapon currently available: information. Her first action was auditory terrain shaping. She picked up the internal phone and dialed the extension for the pediatrics wing, 2 floors up. When a sleepy voice answered, She spoke in a clear, slightly urgent monotone. Code Gray containment team to Station Alpha for decon briefing. Repeat, Station Alpha. She hung up before a question could be asked. The call was meaningless jargon, but its effect was immediate. Over the PA system, a confused supervisor's voice echoed her words. Containment team to Station Alpha. The phrase decon briefing would seep under the curtain of Bay 3, reinforcing her biohazard fiction, adding a layer of institutional scale to her bluff. Next, she isolated the threat physically. She walked to the wall near Bay 3 and manually flipped a small, rarely used switch. A soft yellow light began to strobe above the bay's entrance, and a digital sign lit up, Contamination Protocol, Restricted Access. It was a measure for infectious disease outbreaks. To the men inside, it would feel like being sealed in a glowing designated box. She then triaged her own assets. The staff were non-combatants, but they were pieces on the board. Chloe was anxious but followed direct orders precisely. Lena sent her to the far end of the corridor to restock the crash cart from the main supply, moving her away from the focal point. Dr. Evans was arrogant but decisive in a medical crisis. She paged him stat to a room at the opposite end of the wing for a patient DSAT, giving him a real task that consumed his attention and removed a volatile element from the immediate area. Her most reliable asset was Ben, the orderly. He was a large, quiet man in his 50s, an Army veteran with a bad knee who never spoke of his service. Lena approached him as he was moving linens. She didn't ask for help. She gave him a situational report. "Ben," she said, her voice low, "the lockdown suspects are in Bay 3. They're armed. Security is not equipped. I need a heavy barrier moved to the nurses' station corridor junction on the interior side, something that looks routine." Ben's eyes met hers. He didn't see a nurse. He saw a familiar, unsettling calm, a tone he recognized. He didn't ask how she knew they were armed. He simply gave a single, slow nod. "The broken autoclave," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "It's on a skid. I was supposed to shift it to maintenance tomorrow." "Now is better," Lena said. 10 minutes later, Ben was slowly, noisily winching a large, decommissioned sterilizer unit, a hulking piece of stainless steel machinery on a wheeled skid, across the junction where the ER corridor met the main hospital hallway. It was a perfectly logical, if odd, time for such a task. It also created a substantial metal barrier that funneled anyone coming from Bay 3 into a narrow, controlled approach past the nurses' station. It was not a barricade. It was a broken equipment problem. But it changed the geography of the fight. Lena returned to her schematic. She now assigned her own symbols. A solid square for Ben's position at the autoclave, a triangle for the security office, a dotted line representing the sightline from the station console to Bay 3's curtain. She assessed the 3 marks again. The leader, line, was the intellect, the command. The follower, circle, was the instrument, now frustrated. The injured one, check, was the wild card, his real condition an unknown. A plan began to form, cold and clear. You don't attack the command. You don't initially confront the instrument. You exploit the wild card. The crisis was no longer a spreading fog. It was a contained, 3-pointed problem. And Lena had just finished quietly, plausibly rearranging the world around it. She had no gun, no badge, no authority, but she had control of the environment, the information flow, and the single most valuable commodity in a siege, the illusion of normalcy. The next move was theirs, but the board was hers. The catalyst was real, and it arrived with a piercing electronic shriek at 5:07 a.m. The cardiac alarm from room 308 was a sound that severed all other realities. It wasn't the gentle chime of a wandering sensor. It was the sustained, desperate wail of a heart throwing itself into a lethal rhythm. For every medical professional in the wing, it triggered a deep, autonomic switch. Lena's head snapped toward the sound, her tactical map dissolving into a clinical one. Room 308, Mrs. Gable, 78, post-cardiac stent, frail. The monitor at the station showed a chaotic, jagged line, ventricular tachycardia. It was a true crisis, a matter of minutes. Code blue, room 308, code blue. Dr. Evans's voice roared from down the hall, all arrogance gone, replaced by raw command. Doors flew open. The crash cart, its contents meticulously arranged by Chloe an hour before, was already rumbling down the corridor, pulled by a sprinting nurse. Chaos, but of a specific life-saving kind, descended. And from Bay 3, the curtain was yanked aside. The leader stood in the opening, his pistol now held low against his thigh, no longer concealed. The code blue had shattered the fragile, waiting silence. His face was a mask of panicked suspicion. To him, this sudden, explosive medical response could only be a cover for a police assault. "What is this?" he barked, his voice straining over the alarm. "Shut that off!" Lena was already in motion, not toward the code, but toward him, intercepting his line of sight to the frantic activity. She held her hands up, empty, but her posture was not one of surrender. It was one of stark, urgent authority. "That alarm is for a dying woman," she stated, her voice cutting through the noise, leaving no room for argument. "If you interfere, she dies, and then you are no longer just lockdown suspects. You are murderers in a room full of witnesses and live-streaming medical telemetry. The police negotiation changes. Everything changes." Their eyes locked. The alarm screamed. Behind him, the wild card on the gurney moaned, a genuine sound of distress. The leader's jaw tightened. He was a tactician, and she had just framed the situation in brutal tactical terms. A move against the code team was a catastrophic escalation with no gain. He gave a sharp, furious jerk of his head back into the bay, pulling the curtain shut. Lena didn't wait. She turned and plunged into the controlled storm of room 308. The room was a symphony of controlled urgency. Dr. Evans was calling for meds. Chloe was applying defibrillator pads. The air crackled with tension. Lena's role was medication nurse. She moved to the crash cart, her fingers flying over the locked drawers, bypassing the standard security code with a sequence she shouldn't have known. She drew up ampules of epinephrine, of amiodarone, her hands steady as stone. But her mind was split. As she passed a syringe to Evans, her gaze swept the cart's lower tray. Nestled in a sealed, sterile kit for emergency thoracotomy was a 15-centimeter surgical trocar, a long, sharp stainless steel tube with a handle designed to relieve pressure from a collapsed lung. It was a tool of last resort in trauma. The code progressed. "Clear!" Evans yelled. The body on the bed jolted. The monitor flatlined, then stuttered back into a weak but organized rhythm. "We have a pulse." In the relative sigh of relief, as the team began to stabilize, Lena performed her move. Under the cover of leaning over to dispose of an empty vial, her body blocking the view of the others, her hand closed over the sealed plastic pouch containing the trocar. A practiced twist of her wrist slipped it from its nesting. She palmed it, the cool, heavy cylinder a shocking weight against her skin. In one fluid motion, she tucked it into the deep front pocket of her scrubs, the fabric falling to conceal the bulge. It was not a weapon. It was a medical instrument. But in her hand, in this context, it was a shift in the balance of power. A shift no one saw. Back in the corridor, the silence after the alarm felt heavier. Ben stood by his autoclave barrier, watching Bay 3. He gave Lena the slightest nod. The curtain remained closed. Lena returned to the nurse's station, her breath even, the trocar a cold secret against her thigh. The medical crisis had passed, saving Mrs. Gable. The tactical crisis had escalated. She had used the real emergency to mask a critical acquisition. The leader now knew the hospital could erupt into life-saving chaos beyond his control, and he knew Lena operated within that chaos. She looked at her schematic. Next to her own position, she drew a small, dark circle, an asset acquired. The wild card in Bay 3 was still an unknown, but she was no longer unarmed. The next phase would not be about manipulation of the environment. It would be about direct application of force. The cost of taking the trocar was a moral line crossed. She had stolen a surgical tool, compromising its availability for a real future trauma. She had chosen the immediate threat over the potential one. The weight in her pocket was the weight of that choice. The pressure cooker exploded at 5:34 a.m. It was not with a bang, but with a whimper of terror. The nursing student, Maya, whom Lena had comforted hours before, had been tasked with taking hourly vitals. Confused by the lockdown and the flashing contamination light, she'd misread the bay number. Her hand, holding a blood pressure cuff, pushed through the curtain of Bay 3. A sharp gasp, a muffled cry. Lena, at the station, saw it in freeze frames, the curtain bulging violently, Maya's clipboard clattering to the floor. The leader's arm snaked around her neck, dragging her backwards into the dim bay. The girl's eyes, wide with incomprehension, found Lena's for a terrified second before she disappeared behind the blue fabric. A new, deeper silence fell. The staff froze. Ben's hand tightened on a wrench he'd laid on the autoclave. Officer Riggs took a step forward, his taser raised but useless. Lena felt the cold cylinder of the trocar in her pocket. She calculated angles, distances, the thin curtain. A thrown trocar was a gamble. A charge was suicide. The leader now had a human shield, young, soft, and utterly vulnerable. He had just escalated to hostages. Her decision was methodical, devoid of hesitation. It was a sacrifice play, a deliberate loss of position to gain a greater advantage. She would trade the relative safety of the operational perimeter for control of the inner sanctum. She raised her hands, empty palms forward, and took a step toward the bay. "Don't," she said, her voice carrying in the dead air. It wasn't a plea. It was a command to her own side. She stopped 3 feet from the curtain. "You have a nursing student. She's 19. She knows nothing. Her vital sign readings won't help your friend." She kept her tone analytical, stripping the emotion from the transaction. "You need a clinician, someone who can actually assess and treat." The curtain twitched. The leader's face appeared beside Maya's pale cheek. His eyes were narrowed, searching for the trap. "You?" "Me," Lena confirmed. "I'm the senior nurse on duty. The student is a liability. She'll panic. She'll make mistakes. I won't." She paused, letting the cold logic settle. "You trade her for me. You upgrade your asset, and you show the security outside that you're reasonable. It keeps the police negotiators' options open when they arrive." She was speaking his language. Asset upgrade, liability reduction, negotiation posture. He was silent for 5 long seconds, weighing. The wild card on the gurney groaned again, a wet, rattling sound that was unmistakably real. The medical fiction was collapsing. The man was genuinely in distress, likely from a real injury sustained during their flight. They needed a nurse. "Throw your phone. Any electronics?" "Now." Lena slowly pulled her hospital pager from her waistband, then a personal cell phone from her deep pocket, carefully away from the trocar. She tossed them onto the floor. "Open your scrubs tops slow." She unzipped her blue scrub jacket, held it open. She wore a simple tank top beneath, no wires, no weapons. "Turn around. Lift the back." She complied, moving with slow precision, exposing the small of her back. She felt every eye in the corridor on her. She was demonstrating vulnerability, but the act felt like a soldier's pre-op inspection. "Okay," the leader said. "You walk in, she walks out. Any trick? I put a bullet in your spine first." "Understood," Lena said, as if agreeing to a shift change protocol. She stepped forward. The curtain opened. The follower yanked her inside roughly, while the leader shoved Maya out. The girl stumbled, sobbing into Ben's waiting arms. The curtain closed. Lena was now in the belly of the beast. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and antiseptic. The wild card on the gurney was pale, his breathing shallow and rapid. Shock, possibly internal bleeding. The follower stood by the curtain, gun pointed at her. The leader stood opposite, his weapon now unequivocally in his hand. She had given up the board, the environment, the information flow. She had voluntarily entered the kill zone. But in doing so, she had achieved two critical objectives. She had secured the release of a true non-combatant, and she had positioned herself at the very center of the threat. The game was no longer about corridors and choke points. It was now about the 3 feet of space between her and the leader, the gurney, and the steel in her pocket. She met the leader's gaze, her own empty of fear. She was no longer just a nurse. She was inside their decision loop. The cost of the play was her safety. The potential gain was everything. The inside of Bay 3 was a compressed world of fear and pain. The overhead light was off, only the ambient glow from the corridor seeping around the curtain's edges, painting the men in bruised shadows. Lena stood still, her hands held slightly away from her body, her breathing measured. The follower, Mike, kept his pistol trained on her chest, his breath shallow. The leader's eyes never left her. The third man, the wild card on the gurney, writhed, a low, continuous moan escaping his lips. "Check him," the leader ordered, nodding toward the gurney. Lena moved without haste. She stepped to the man's side, her movements clinical. She peeled back the blood-soaked hoodie. The wound was a ragged, deep laceration below the ribs, not a clean stab. It was packed with makeshift gauze from a convenience store first aid kit, now saturated. The skin around it was hot, inflamed, early peritonitis. This man was septic, dying from an infection that had festered for hours, possibly from a botched attempt at field care. "He has a severe abdominal infection," she stated, her voice flat. "Blood poisoning. He needs intravenous antibiotics and surgery. Now. Your pressure on the wound is irrelevant." "Fix it," the leader snapped. "I can't. Not here. He needs an OR." She looked up, meeting the leader's stare. "His name is Carver, isn't it? Former 3rd Battalion, Riverine. Dishonorably discharged 2 years ago for assault. The other is Miller. You're Vance." A microscopic crack appeared in Vance's composure. His finger tightened on the trigger guard. "Who are you?" "I'm the person who knows you're not bank robbers," Lena said, turning back to the wound as if discussing a mundane chart note. "The police scanner said robbery, but your man's injury is 12 to 18 hours old. This was a deal gone wrong. A fallout between contractors. You shot a rival, maybe a client, and got shot back. You came here because it was the closest cover, not part of a plan. This," she gestured around the bay, "is a panic move. And now you're trapped in it with a dying man." She was dismantling his narrative, stripping away his control of the story. Miller, the follower, shifted nervously. "Vance?" "Shut up," Vance hissed, but the doubt was seated. Lena picked up a clean roll of gauze from a tray. "You have 2 options. You let him die here and add murder by neglect to whatever charges you're facing when SWAT floods this room. Or you surrender him to medical care. It's the only chip you have left that might buy a shred of goodwill." "We surrender him. We have nothing," Vance spat. "You have me," Lena said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It wasn't an offer. It was a fact. And I am a more valuable hostage than a dying man, but only if he's alive. His death makes me a witness to a murder. Less valuable." She was reasoning him into a corner with cold, inarguable logic. The wild card, Carver, was no longer an asset, but a liability dragging them down. Vance's eyes darted between his dying comrade and Lena. The calculus was breaking him. Carver chose that moment to arch his back, a guttural cry tearing from his throat. Miller flinched, his gun wavering for a split second toward the sound. It was the only distraction Lena would get. Her hand dove into her pocket, not with a dramatic flourish, but with the efficient, practiced speed of a muscle memory drilled 10,000 times. The surgical trocar was in her hand. She did not raise it to stab. As Vance's eyes snapped back to her, his gun starting to level, she drove the blunt, heavy handle of the trocar forward like a short baton, not at his body, but at the weapon in his hand. The steel connected with the slide of his pistol with a sharp metallic crack, knocking the barrel offline. Simultaneously, her other hand shot out, not to grab the gun, but to his wrist. Her thumb found the pressure point on the radial nerve, a precise crushing dig. His fingers spasmed open. The pistol fell, clattering against the linoleum. Miller swung his gun toward her. Lena didn't release Vance. She used her grip on his wrist as a pivot, pulling the snarling leader off balance and into Miller's line of fire. Miller hesitated, afraid to hit his boss. That hesitation was fatal. Lena moved with Vance's stumble, her body flowing inside Miller's guard. She brought the trocar up, not with a stabbing motion, but a short, brutal jab. The target was not his heart or throat. It was the brachial plexus nerve cluster under his collarbone. The pointed tip, designed to pierce chest walls, delivered focused, agonizing trauma to the nerves controlling his arm. Miller screamed, a high, shocked sound. His entire right side went limp, his gun dropping from nerveless fingers. He collapsed against the wall, clutching his shoulder, white-faced and gasping. Vance, his right arm still singing with pain from the nerve strike, lunged for his fallen gun with his left hand. Lena's foot came down on his wrist, pinning it. She didn't stomp. She applied steady, inexorable pressure, her weight centered. He grunted, straining, but couldn't move it. She stood over him, breathing lightly, the trocar held low at her side. The fight had lasted less than 7 seconds. It was not a brawl, it was a clinic. A swift, precise application of leverage, anatomy, and controlled violence. The bay was silent save for Carver's ragged moans and Miller's choked sobs. Vance stared up at her, his defiance extinguished, replaced by a hollow, knowing dread. He saw it now clearly, in her poised stillness, in the economy of her violence, in the flat sea gray of her eyes. "You're not a nurse," he breathed. Lena said nothing. She simply watched him, her expression unchanged. The quiet in the room was absolute, and it belonged entirely to her. The silence was shattered by the sound of the curtain rings shrieking along their rod. The heavy fabric was ripped aside, not by a hesitant officer, but by the controlled, explosive entry of SWAT. Black helmets, armored vests, and leveled rifles filled the opening. "Down! Get down on the ground!" The commands were thunderous, absolute. Lena was already moving. As the first word left the lead officer's mouth, she dropped the trocar. It clattered, harmless, on the floor. She placed her hands on her head and went to her knees, turning her back to the armed men, presenting a profile of complete non-threat. She kept her eyes down, fixed on a speck of blood on the linoleum. Her submission was immediate, total, and rehearsed. 2 armed suspects down, 1 medical, hostage secure. The calls echoed. Heavy boots swarmed around her. Vance and Miller were dragged roughly to their stomachs, cuffed with harsh metallic clicks. The team swarmed over them, securing weapons, barking clearances. A paramedic in tactical gear rushed to Carver on the gurney, beginning an assessment. "GSW complication, septic shock, critical," Lena stated to the floor, her voice a monotone. The paramedic grunted an acknowledgement. The lead SWAT commander, a broad-shouldered man with Harper on his vest, stood over her. "You the nurse?" "Yes," Lena said, not looking up. "Are you injured?" "No." "Did they harm you?" "No." Her answers were clean, short, devoid of narrative. Harper gestured, and a female officer helped Lena to her feet. Her legs felt distant, rubbery, but they held. She was guided out of the bay into the blinding brightness of the corridor. The scene outside was a tableau of organized chaos. Police everywhere, flashing lights from parked cruisers painting the walls in silent red and blue. The staff huddled by the lounge, wrapped in foil blankets, some crying. Chloe saw her and started forward, but was held back by an officer. Ben stood apart, leaning on his autoclave, his gaze locked on Lena. He gave that same slow, deep nod. She did not nod back. She was sat on a gurney at the edge of the activity, a buffer zone between the crime scene and the rest of the hospital. A detective in a rumpled suit took her statement. She gave him the bare facts. The men's arrival, their agitation, the lockdown, their arming themselves, the taking of the student, the trade. She described their injuries and panic. She described the struggle as a chaotic, lucky break. Vance dropping his gun when Carver seized, her grabbing it, Miller slipping and falling hard against the wall when he tried to lunge. Her voice was hollow, with believable shock. "You're saying you disarmed 2 men with firearms?" the detective asked, skepticism etching his face. "I'm saying they were distracted, scared, and clumsy," Lena corrected, her eyes tired. "And I was desperate not to die. It wasn't skill. It was a mess." He took notes, his expression unconvinced. As he finished, Walters, the head of security, approached. He dismissed the detective with a look. He stood before Lena, his thick arms crossed. He looked from her to the open bay where the trocar now lay in an evidence bag, to Ben by the barrier. "I checked the crash cart log," Walters said, his voice low. "A sealed thoracotomy kit was signed out to Bay 3 by a nurse's override code during that code blue. That kit is now missing 1 trocar." He paused. "The one on the floor in there." Lena said nothing. She met his gaze, waiting. "I was LAPD, 20 years. SWAT liaison for 5, he said. "I've seen trained men move. That wasn't a mess in there." He studied her face, the faded tattoo on her hand, the absolute calm beneath the performed exhaustion. "I'm not going to ask, because I don't want to know, and neither do you." He wasn't thanking her. He was offering a silent pact of mutually assured ignorance. He turned to leave, then stopped. "Your shift ended 20 minutes ago. Go home." He walked away. The cost of the victory settled onto Lena's shoulders. It was the weight of the lie, the weight of the stolen steel, the weight of the knowledge in Walter's eyes. There was no triumph here. Only a quiet, burdensome salvage operation, and the first cold touch of exposure. The dawn was a pale, watery gray, leaching the artificial glare from the sky. Lena emerged not through the main ER doors, still cordoned with yellow tape, but through a side exit by the laundry bay. The air was cold and smelled of damp concrete and distant rain, a cleansing scent after the cloying antiseptic and sweat of the night. She had changed into civilian clothes from her locker, faded jeans, a plain gray sweatshirt, a worn canvas jacket. She carried nothing but her keys and a small zippered pouch. In the pocket of her jacket, folded small, was the patient intake form with its cryptic marks. The parking lot was a sea of vehicles, but hers stood apart at the far edge, a 10-year-old sedan, beige, unremarkable, washed to a dull matte by years of sun and indifference. She unlocked it, the sound loud in the morning stillness. She did not look back at the hospital. Inside the car, the silence was profound. She sat for a long moment, her hands resting on the steering wheel. They were clean now, but she could still feel the specific, reverberating impact of steel on pistol slide, the give of nerve clusters under pressure. She flexed her fingers slowly, watching the tendons move. Then she started the engine. It turned over with a reliable, muted rumble. She drove not toward home, but toward the river, following a route of empty industrial streets. At an overlook, a barren patch of gravel above the water, she parked. The city across the river was waking up, its lights dimming against the gray sky. Life continued, oblivious. From her jacket pocket, she pulled the folded paper. She smoothed it on her knee under the dashboard's gloom. The schematics stared back, the 3 marks, her own symbols, the lines of control and threat. A record of a battle no one would ever officially acknowledge. Methodically, she began to tear it. Not into halves or quarters, but into tiny, confetti-like pieces. The rips were soft, precise. Line, circle, check, square, triangle, all fragmented into meaningless scraps. She rolled down the window. The cold air rushed in. She opened her hand, letting the pieces be caught by the wind. A miniature blizzard of evidence scattering over the scrub grass and down the embankment towards the indifferent river. She rolled the window up. The silence returned. Her phone, a cheap burner replaced after leaving her personal one for evidence, buzzed once in the pouch. A single encrypted line of text from a number that didn't exist. Status? She typed a single character. Z. Quiet. Secured. No reply came. None was needed. She put the car in drive and pulled back onto the road, merging with the thin, early morning traffic. In her rearview mirror, the hospital receded, just another block of shadow against the lightening sky. There would be no commendation, no story in the paper. Chloe might speak of a brave nurse for a day or two. Walters would file a report full of cautious omissions. The official narrative would settle on luck and desperation, a tale that suited everyone. For Lena, there was only the quiet, the heavy, earned quiet of a job done, a perimeter held, and a self that remained, as it must, in the shadows. The night shift was over. She drove on, just another face in the gray dawn. The weight of the secret a familiar, solitary companion. The only trophy she carried was the exhaustion and the unbroken silence. It was enough.